Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on Fat Burning Man, where we talk about real food and real results. What if your doctor told you to eat more fat? That day might be coming sooner than you think. In the scientific community, high-fat ketogenic diets are suddenly in vogue. More specifically, the ketogenic diet is being studied for its potential to treat epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and even Alzheimer's. Today, we're here with a pioneering female scientist, Dr. Mithu Storoni, who eats a diet of 70% plus fat. You're going to learn the surprising reasons why. Now, I wasn't planning to start with this, but have you tried the new Pokemon Go app yet? The augmented reality craze is officially here. Pokemon is an extremely welcome distraction from all of the terrible world news of late. And if you're wondering what Fat Burning Man thinks of Pokemon Go, not to brag, but Fat Burning Man is, as of right now, a level 16 on Team Instinct with one heck of a good gold duck. So remember, choose Team Yellow when you get the choice. You'll have my wife, Allison, and Fat Burning Man on your team. And remember, Allison once made her living as a pro gamer, so you want us on your side. And by the way, you can follow Abel James or Fat Burning Man on social media for a picture of a wild frittata recipe. It's terrible. While we're on social media, here's a success story that just came in. This is from Matthew, and he tagged me on Instagram. He says, I recently finished a nutritional program called The Wild Diet. I can't believe I've lost 38 pounds in 3 months. I'm excited for this next journey in my life. Hashtag The Wild Diet, hashtag Team Bacon. Those are great hashtags right there. Remember those. If you're on Instagram, make sure to take a picture of your before and after pictures and tag me under Fat Burning Man or the hashtag The Wild Diet or Abel James. You can find me there too. I see all of these that pop up in my feeds, and I respond to as many as I can. So always love hearing from you guys. If you'd like to check out The Wild Diet yourself, you can grab my New York Times best-selling book of the same name on Amazon or anywhere books are sold. But here's some good news. If you bought our online Wild Diet fat loss program anytime in the past 5 years, we just added a brand new 30-day wild meal plan that you can download for free. It's waiting for you in the members area right now. And if you have any trouble with your username or password, just shoot us an email. We'll get right back to you and fix you right up. Now, if you haven't tried the Wild Diet yet and you want to get started, this is your last chance to get the whole cannoli for a huge discount. You'll get everything you need to get results right away, including the Wild Diet Fat Loss Manual, Motivation Journal, Workout Worksheet, done-for-you meal plans, quick start guides with audio and video bonuses galore. If you're ready to start shedding stubborn fat while eating delicious food, get our 30-day program for a limited time discount at fatburningman.com/30 days. That's the number 30, DAYS. fatburningman.com/30 days. All right, on to the show with Dr. Mithu Storoni. We'll explore how a ketogenic diet can prevent and heal neurodegeneration, why a healthy female scientist would suddenly cut carbs and eat more fat, why eating a jar of almond butter is bad for your brain, how to avoid common low-carb mistakes, why cutting back on fruit might do the body good, and much more. Let's go hang out with the doc. All right, folks, today we're here with a true fat-burning woman. Dr. Mithu Storoni has been following a ketogenic diet since 2014 and recently co-wrote a pioneering paper recommending a ketogenic diet for the treatment of multiple sclerosis. Mithu has a medical degree from the University of Cambridge, a PhD in neuro-ophthalmology, and holds a deep fascination for how the brain is affected by stress and what we can do about it. Mithu is also a yoga instructor, avid matcha drinker, Japan lover, and is always looking for new ways to reprogram her brain. Joining us from across the world in Hong Kong, thank you so much for being here, Mithu.
Thank you very much, Abel, for having me. It's a huge honor to be on your show.
Thank you so much. So you may be preaching to the choir for the listeners out there, but why are you so in love with fat?
I'm in love with fat because the moment I switched to eating fat, my whole world changed. This is my personal account. I think that we have gone through a long period of time when a lot of things were regulated, were set in a way, and we never shifted from the pattern. We never questioned any other way. And we've come to a point now in science and in medicine where we're forced to re-examine everything, partly from some accidental results of studies that were carried out before, partly from some studies which were buried for a long time. And I think we've come to a point now we have the most incredible brain scans showing us results we never imagined we would ever have before. And all of that is converging to the idea that fat is incredibly important for us and not the villain that we used to think, or rather, we were brought up to think it is.
Right.
So, yeah.
A healthy diet for so many of us, especially in America, but I'm sure across the world as well, as long as you were avoiding fat and keeping it as low as possible. This is what my doctor told me, what I read in a lot of different places when I got sick in my early 20s. But that was the one thing that you had to do, was eat less fat or eat no fat. Now it seems like everyone wants us to eat more.
That's right. I mean, I spent a lot of my life, especially when I was younger, being very careful about avoiding fat and basing things on a carbohydrate-based diet. I mean, I think that as a population, as humanity, we always want to do the best, and we always go by the data that we have, the information that we have to form the best judgment. And we always want one rule. So we want one villain and we want one ingredient. And I think that the culmination of the studies from the post-Second World War era especially pointed towards fat being a villain. And it was assigned a villain, in good faith, because that's what the studies that were generated at the time gave us to believe. But now we are progressing so much, and we've seen 50 years of the effect of that kind of a diet and that kind of a lifestyle.
It's not pretty.
Now it's becoming, now we have more studies. So we, as a good scientist, we should always recalibrate as we go along.
Yes.
And our previous calibration was clearly not correct. So now we're moving further.
And science is starting to show that there are a lot of benefits to a ketogenic diet. Now, when you talk about epilepsy, a ketogenic diet has been used for a long time, but you're starting to see that it's very useful for other conditions as well, right?
That's right. I mean, it's a shame because it was originally used, Hippocrates used starvation to treat epilepsy. And at the start of the last century, the ketogenic diet was used to treat epilepsy. It's starvation first, then the ketogenic diet. And then, of course, with the advent of medication, it became far less popular because it's easier to give a child something than to tell a child what to eat.
Right.
So it got,
or an adult.
Also, that's right. Don't we all? But also, the diets at the time were very, very strict and were very... they didn't allow for a lot of the flexibility that the ketogenic diets allow today. So some of the diets did produce some negative effects during that time, and they weren't favored quite as much.
Right.
So it went down by the wayside. And then, of course, there was the advent of Dr. Atkins's diet, which is not strictly a ketogenic diet, but it can be in some instances. And, some of the studies, there are a couple of papers in the literature on, for instance, people following the Dr. Atkins diet and their migraines getting better or their epilepsy being affected. So I think all of this drew attention back to what exactly is going on. Are we missing something? And of course, epilepsy that's not been responsive to medication was still treated with the ketogenic diet in the meantime.
Right.
So that's right. So now suddenly the floodgates are opening, and we're noticing all these observational case studies that have been recorded over the last half a century, and that's bringing our attention back.
Yes, and when you look at something like multiple sclerosis, the treatment options, most of them aren't as simple as eating fat and staying away from glucose and sugar. But in reading your paper, it's so fascinating to me, the power of nutrition and our diet over the way that not just our bodies, but especially our brains work. And not just in the present either, but there are a lot of long-term advantages to eating in certain ways. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So The ketogenic diet is so specific to multiple sclerosis. I think MS has been a condition that has baffled us for a long time. We've identified it a long time ago, and its variants have emerged over the years. So things which we wouldn't classify as MS, we now do classify as MS. And it really is a very broad spectrum. We have usually focused on treating the inflammation part of MS. So in MS, I think many of us would know at least one person with MS. It's a pretty common, sadly, pretty common condition. You get immune cells attacking your nervous system, and we think that that attack happens as a result. So you have a barrier between your brain and your body's blood supply, and if that barrier breaks, the immune cells from your body can go to your brain, and we think that's part of the process by which you get these acute inflammatory episodes. But with MS, actually, some amazing, again, the advances in technology have allowed people to ascertain this, but the advances in technology have revealed some interesting things to people. For instance, if you look at the retina of people with MS, even if they've not had any eye involvement, that retina is thinner. And becomes thinner progressively, as shown by OCT studies. And you can do all sorts of imaging as well in different parts of the brain that have given clues about the fact that there is something else going on apart from inflammation. And finally, we've arrived at the fact that there is definitely neurodegeneration going on. So brain cells are degenerating in a similar fashion to how they would do in Alzheimer's disease, for instance, and in other neurodegenerative disease with which, sadly, again, most of us are pretty familiar. So the fact that both of these exist is very interesting, and it's a new change because in the past we didn't know that both of these existed. So all the treatment focused on calming the inflammation. And of course, it's the inflammation that gives the majority of patients with MS who have relapsing and remitting MS, that gives them the symptoms. So if you calm the inflammation, they don't get those acute attacks. So that's what the medication has traditionally done, and it's been very useful at doing. But we've noticed that nonetheless, even without getting inflammation, there are patients who still progress. And when they progress, we notice neurodegeneration. And that's where your original question, the ketogenic diet's potential, comes in. So the next question to ask is, what causes the neurodegeneration? So what causes the neurodegeneration of Alzheimer's disease? What causes the neurodegeneration of aging, simple aging, frontotemporal dementia, all of those? And again, this is $1 million question. And even if, no matter how confident we feel, there are still going to be many things that we don't know. But we are coming closer to establishing that neurodegeneration is largely contributed to by the mitochondria failing in many of these cases. And mitochondria, when mitochondria fail, the energy supply of the brain cell is compromised. So within the brain, for instance, we know that you have brain cells, so the neurons, and you also have supporting cells known as astrocytes, which are like scaffolding within the brain. You also have microglia, which are the inflammatory cells. Now, astrocytes supply the brain cells with lactate for nutrition, and we've only just discovered something known as a lactate shuttle. When nutrition, so when the energy supply of brain cells becomes compromised, if you continue to supply glucose, that results in a much more negative result than if you sometimes give nothing at all. So if glucose uptake is compromised, so you have, if there's mitochondrial damage, or if, broadly speaking, you look into a brain, or you look at the scan of a brain and you notice reduced glucose use by the brain, which you find in multiple sclerosis, you find in Alzheimer's disease, then you know that if you give glucose and the brain cannot use it, the mitochondria cannot use it, it's, you need another option, you need another fuel supply. And that's where ketones come in. So if you give ketones in a context where the machinery needed to use glucose becomes impaired, then the brain cell continues to survive. And you look at lesions in MS, so you look at areas of damage within the brain in MS, or in other conditions such as in glaucoma, which is a disease of the eye, where optic nerve cells, so also neurons, are also affected. But wherever you look, if you have a brain cell with good, healthy mitochondria that are getting a good energy supply, then it can withstand heaps of damage and attack. And if a brain cell or a group of brain cells are neurodegenerating, those brain cells are struggling. So they are, in effect, under attack.
Yeah.
So in that situation, if you give them glucose, you are far less likely to help them than if you give them an alternative energy supply, such as ketones. And that's where the ketogenic diet comes in.
So it seems like if you're feeding your brain glucose, especially later in life, it's kind of like putting gasoline on the fire. If you're already experiencing brain fog or mental problems, then feeding ourselves the way that we have been for the past few decades, at least, is really accelerating the damage.
That's right. And also, the recent research, which has again brought astrocytes into the forefront of our vision. So we've always focused on the neurons. The astrocytes are the scaffolding within the brain. So if we think of the astrocytes, we've assumed they've had a role. We've just seen them through the corner of our eye, but it turns out, as I said, they supply neurons with lactate, but they also have several other incredibly important functions. So one of them, for instance, is clearing away glutamate. So glutamate is a neurotransmitter which has so it excites cells. It has an excitatory function. And we use it hugely in our prefrontal cortex, for instance, where pyramidal cells signal using glutamate. So glutamate, it's great when we need it, but it excites cells. So we need to clear it away the moment there is too much of it.
Sure.
And if we leave too much glutamate around, the cells continue to be excited and fall down dead. Not literally, but
right.
Excitotoxicity is how we call it. So lots of mechanisms are triggered and the neuron suffers. So the astrocyte, this second type of cell in the brain, clears away glutamate. And one of the recent observations with sugar, for instance, is hyperglycemia prevents astrocytes from doing this. So it actually has a direct effect on astrocytes not being able to clear away glutamate levels. So, in your analogy of an aging brain or of a neurodegenerative brain, or degenerative brain rather, if you have a lot of glutamate there, if you have the astrocytes damaged, if you have the neurons damaged, and if you have glutamate there, because the astrocytes cannot clear away the glutamate fast enough, because there's also lots of glucose around, you're feeding the brain a lot of sugar, you might have type 2 diabetes, then you are adding even more fuel to the fire, just as you said. Yeah. So with an aging brain, so we know, for instance, that with Alzheimer's disease, there is definite reduction in the brain's ability to use glucose. This has been demonstrated beautifully in a special type of scan called an FDG scan by several groups. And, it is not something that anyone would dispute at the moment, which is why there were some early reports of, for instance, coconut oil helping people with Alzheimer's disease through its NCT content, which breaks into ketones. But also, we're finding more and more reports of this, and these are now replicated in a lab. So that's a fact. What is interesting is, when does it begin, and is it the glucose problem that actually causes the Alzheimer's disease? Right. And I think that, to me, is the most exciting point of study. And there's a team in California, Professor Brinton's team, for instance, she's looking at, her team is looking at female brains, female aging brains. And I know that in rats, it was discovered that as soon as rats or mice hit menopause, even if they don't have Alzheimer's disease, the ability to use glucose plummets.
Wow.
And you can kind of predict and think that, well, if that's the case, then are all these, if this also happens in humans, so first that has to be shown, but assuming it does it mean, in 20 years, 30 years time, it's predictive of us all developing some degree of dementia? Yeah. Because if you look at, there's another condition in vision called Leber hereditary optic neuropathy, or LHON. And in it, that is a mitochondrial, it's an inherited mitochondrial condition resulting in blindness, sadly affecting young men. And in that condition, it takes about 20 years from birth to blindness to first surface. And then there's another analogy. If you look at people who are predisposed to getting Alzheimer's disease, and you look at them when they're healthy and young, say around when they're 40 and 50, and Alzheimer's would normally hit them when they're 70 or 80. People who are predisposed to having Alzheimer's disease because of a strong family history have more of a decline in the ability to use glucose in their 40s, in their 50s, compared to people who don't develop Alzheimer's. So glucose may well be one of the epigenetic triggers of Alzheimer's. So that is, I think, the next thing that's being looked at right now. We don't have the answer, but it's a very exciting and alarming concept.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. So you went ketogenic yourself in 2014. What was the biggest reason, and what did you experience?
So I went ketogenic because I was looking at the literature of neurodegeneration, partly related to the field that I was working in at the time, but also just neurodegeneration in general, because it's such a frustrating area. There is really no treatment, and it's a huge burden for the Western world. And in fact, not just for the Western world, it's now coming onto Asia. Quite significantly. So it's a huge burden and it's frustrating. And then I saw all the research about all the papers on, how we can actually hack into the biochemistry of our cells, and how we can hack into our mitochondrial function, our glycolytic function. And then what I saw really convinced me on a biochemical level. And because I was otherwise okay, I do have a strong family history of diabetes, but I was pretty fit and well. I thought, why not try it? It sounds so wacky.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
It sounds so crazy. What's the worst that can happen?
I'm so glad you said that.
So it's interesting because I tried it for, I thought in my head, I tried for 3 months. Yeah. And then I have a very tolerant husband because all our ingredients had to be slightly changed. Our
just eating blocks of cream cheese and butter.
He sees all this coconut. He says, "What's this?" Yeah. Anyway, so I thought I'd try it for 3 months, and then after 3 months, I really felt amazing. Yeah. I mean, I can't describe it to you. I didn't have, so I felt calmer. I didn't have my fluctuating stress levels. I felt, my head was clearer. I mean, these are all subjective symptoms, and I'm sure some of them probably have a placebo effect because I was doing something that I believe in, of course. But nonetheless, I really felt so good that I thought I wasn't going to stop. Yeah. And I didn't stop, and I continued. And then I looked into it more, and the more I looked into it, the more fascinated I became by it. So really, in answer to your question, it was just, I was so impressed by the research results of all the teams working on this from around the world that I thought, my brain is really important to me. Why not?
Absolutely. Yeah, and one of the biggest reasons I did it as well was because of the research that I saw around the brain and the effects it was supposed to have when you fuel with fat as opposed to fueling with glucose. And I was like, yeah, whatever. That sounds totally wacky. It's the same way that, you had that reaction. But my personality actually changed. Once I started fueling in a different way, once my brain became fat adapted, I suppose, I noticed that there's it's a totally different way of going about your day. You're much more balanced, like you said, clear, and it's not like one of those jerky energies that you get when you have caffeine or something like that. It's not something that unbalances you. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You feel very balanced as long as you're eating enough anyway. And as long as because that can be one of the challenges, especially at the beginning, right? Because you go from eating these, you basically flip your diet on its head, right? You go from avoiding all these things and eating those instead, right? You're just loading up on the coconut oil. What were some of the other things that you started eating that surprised you when you started feeling the fat?
So it's very interesting because I went through, because it was an experiment on myself, I could be as crazy as I wanted to. So
that's part of the fun, yeah.
So I started off, I measured my visceral fat level, and I got, my body fat, all of those tested. And then I started, first of all, focusing on, so my diet before, I should probably tell you what I was eating before. So before that, I was pretty healthy. I'm a girl, all girls try to be healthy, after a certain age, all the weight piles on, so you have to be careful. But, so my diet before was, would be proteins, a lot of vegetables, huge amounts of fruit, actually, a lot of fruit. So I moved to Hong Kong, and mangoes were my weakness. They were my favorite,
so good.
In the universe. And when I started doing this diet, the first thing that went was, of course, the fruit. But then, obviously, when I followed the ketogenic diet very specifically, I started mapping my macros, and I thought, how can I get my fat up as I keep cutting down on the protein? So the protein became a little bit difficult to measure because I was probably eating more protein than would put me into ketosis in the initial stages. Okay. So in order to buffer that, I made sure a lot of my fat came from coconut oil, so from their MCTs, because as you know, if you increase your MCT intake, you can still stay in ketosis even if you go a little bit higher with the protein. Right. The carb I didn't have too many problems with. All I needed to do was just cut out the fruit and the starchy vegetables. So in terms of fat, so coconut oil became my staple. Okay. Also, the other reason for it was the studies that I'd read on what happens to the different types of fat on a ketogenic diet. And I think this is a really interesting and emerging field because we know that the ketogenic diet and ketosis is beneficial. Right. What we don't know is, and we don't want to fall into the danger of saying if something is good, it's good in all its forms. Right. Or if something is bad, it's bad in all its forms. Because even if something is good, even in most of its forms, there might be some things in it which we can do a little bit better. So for instance, with fat, we know emerging studies again suggest that the longer chain the saturated fat is, the slightly more likely it is to lead to inflammation if ingested alone. Okay. So for instance, palmitate. So many studies on a high-fat diet in the past were done using palmitic acid. Now, we do need palmitate, and of course our body produces it, and most of the fat stored in our body, a lot of it is in the form of palmitate. But when we eat palmitate, as it enters through our intestines, it causes inflammation, and that's very well known, that's a fact. So if you just eat palmitate and nothing else on a ketogenic diet, it's probably not a great idea. Once the palmitate enters into your body, it's probably okay, or not as bad, but in the intestines it's not good. So for instance, if you eat palmitate, there are studies that show that some other fats are beneficial and can balance out the effects of palmitate. So that's that is one thing to be aware of. So longer chain fats can be a little bit inflammatory if taken in isolation without really buffering. Okay. So I started off eating quite a lot of longer chain fats, and then I started.
In what form was it?
So in the form of, I used to eat a huge amount of cheese, for instance, but even with cheese, you can be selective about which cheese you choose. And I wasn't selective because some types of cheeses have less palmitate, for instance, than other types of cheeses. And the fat oleate can mitigate some of the effects of palmitate. And the oleate ratio is higher, again, in some types of cheese than in other types of cheese. So, knowing this, and not just looking at it as fat, but looking at it as, ratios of fat. So that's important. And of course, the other thing is I was eating a lot of almond butter. And almond butter is good in good portions. However, you have the omega-6 to 3 balance to look at as well. So if you just eat, and I think there was a recent study that emerged that showed that vegetarians can actually increase the risk of inflammation, and hence certain types of cancers, by not focusing on their 3 to 6 ratio. So I found that initially I was being a little careless about, I was having a lot of, omega-6 derived fat and not balancing out. So I was having a lot of pecan nuts, for instance. Pecan nuts are very rich in omega-6. So pecan nuts and cheese and nothing else is not a good idea. Not that was my entire diet, but you see the pattern emerging.
A stepping stone, perhaps.
That's right. So I started switching that, looking more at my fatty fish intake and omega-3 intake and reducing. And then I moved nuts as well, Imagine going to the store and saying, no, not that nut. They're all very good, but which one has the lowest omega-3, omega-6 content? So shifting my nuts to ones that were non-inflammatory fats, shifting my fat to ones which are medium chain, and also increasing my fiber intake, but not through eating resistant starch in the form of fruit or starchy vegetables. So increasing my fiber intake through leafy greens.
Got it.
And also continuing to have some cheese, so keeping my butyrate levels high, which made sure my intestines had I hope my intestines can hear how kind I am to them. But anyway, it's looking at the fat that's going in that became very important to me and became something that I thought people on a ketogenic diet might want to consider more and more as we see some studies emerge.
Right. And that's one of the issues, isn't it? When you look back at the research or just the way that some studies are done, a ketogenic diet is a pretty squishy term. It could describe a lot of different things. You could be feeding yourself or feeding a rat, for example, in a study, 100% corn oil, or feeding them nothing, a starvation diet, essentially. So all of a sudden, the body is starting to break down muscle, which turns into glucose and breaking down fat at the same time. So the way that you're feeding yourself and what you're feeding yourself is more important than just like, is it ketogenic or not? And I hope future research really addresses a balanced ketogenic diet. So along those lines, what do you consider a balanced ketogenic diet?
This is a very good question, and one that I've had a year and a half to think about. And I'm constantly working on what a perfect ketogenic diet should be. And I think that, the honest answer is I still don't know for sure, but I've come to a few conclusions. So I think my first priority would be to make sure the fats stay away from the long chain as much as possible. Bearing in mind we need some, and bearing in mind that our body already has long chain fats. But, steering away a little bit from there is beneficial. Second is having a lot of including monounsaturated fatty acids, such as is done in the Mediterranean. And the studies that show good effects of the ketogenic diet on cardiovascular markers and on weight loss. Of course, weight loss is a very generic term, but primarily cardiovascular markers have shown that a Mediterranean ketogenic diet, which has lots of monounsaturated fats, actually has very beneficial effects on inflammation and on anything else.
So avocado, and coconut from before, so all those are good fat options.
Everything that tastes good.
Yeah, exactly.
I have no problems with the Mediterranean diet. So so olive oil, olives, macadamia nuts, avocados, all very good. The next thing is omega-3, because omega-3 mitigates some of the inflammation from longer chain saturated fatty acids. And then, of course, coconut oil. Now, I use the two terms interchangeably, but of course, coconut oil isn't just MCT, it contains a variety of fats. But the reason I find coconut oil to be quite fascinating is because of the emerging research regarding its use. So, for instance, there have been studies on adding coconut oil to existing inflammatory oil preparations, and those studies suggest that inflammation is reduced whenever coconut oil is also used, whether it's the MCTs from the coconut oil, whether it's something else, we don't know. Yeah. Cardiovascular metabolites, so the cholesterol level, of course, we don't know. Again, we're having to reassess the relationship between cholesterol markers and cardiovascular disease. But nonetheless, with that in mind, coconut oil seems to have a beneficial effect, relatively beneficial effect in that regard. So, and also the production of MCTs means there isn't as great a production of chylomicrons when you're moving the fat. So chylomicrons are the packages into which long chain fats have to be put for the fat to move from the intestine to the liver.
Yeah.
So the medium chain fats, which coconut oil contains about 60% of, don't need that. So again, coconut oil is a good thing to incorporate in a ketogenic diet. And I think there are also two other things. So I think another thing, which one of the people I admire greatly, Dr. Terry Walls, advocates in her diet, which she used to overcome MS quite spectacularly, is the inclusion of lots and lots of colored vegetables.
Right.
So I think that butyrate is important, but I also think phytonutrients become extremely important. So a ketogenic diet involving that as well. And lastly, I think that one point which many of us seem to miss, especially if we're not as athletic as you are, for instance, many of us who are more sedentary and who probably see a gym once in a month or first week of the year after Christmas. A ketogenic diet is most effective if you restrict your calories to as much as you need and not much more. Because if you overfeed on a high-fat diet, it doesn't matter if you're eating diamonds, you will still end up having that fat going somewhere. I mean, admittedly, you won't be able to digest a lot of the fat, but nonetheless, eating to an excess is not a good idea. And that also kind of brings me a little bit full circle, because I kind of think that the way in which we are designed, is it really that eating fat is what is bringing the benefits of the ketogenic diet? So is eating fat the principal thing there, or is restricting your calories, avoiding carbohydrates in combination bringing us to the result? Because if you restrict your calories and drastically cut your carbohydrates, you will end up in ketogenesis.
Right.
Assuming your proteins, are not unnaturally excessive, assuming you don't take any supplements or so on. So the two are pretty similar. And, in the past, we are designed to live in a fasting, feeding mode. And the fasting intervals are the intervals we no longer have in our society, in the world, as it is now. So is it really the elimination of fasting and the reliance on too much sugar that is causing the problems which we are negating through ketosis?
I love that you said that, because that tends to be the way that I think about it. And it's not as much of a friendly thing to say, especially to beginners, right? That, okay, here's the secret to longevity and health for the rest of your life. Make sure that you're not overeating, which is just another way of saying kind of restrict the amount of food that you're eating, or find a way that's actually pleasurable to do that. And I think that eating this way allows you to not be as hungry as you would be otherwise. So it's kind of like a way to circumvent that. And then number two, restrict glucose, or certainly spikes in glucose, the large spikes that you would experience when you eat something like a bagel or a donut or a bunch of bread, or certainly anything that's sugary, which makes up the majority of our diets these days. Most of us are eating on the standard American diet anyway. I think it's 58% of our food is processed, and most of that is made up of processed carbs. So it's more about, it's not necessarily about eating a bunch of butter, bacon, coconut oil, all this stuff, and just shoving it down your throat all day. It's more about allowing your body to become fat adapted so that you're not hungry all the time. You're not getting those spikes in glucose, and your body can start the process, a lot of the good processes that happen when it's allowed to run on fat, because of a reduction in glucose and or calories, energy, whatever way you want to think about it. But the way that I tend to think about it is that it's very difficult to overeat fat and protein when compared to carbs anyway, when compared to sugar, certainly, because you're not getting those ups and downs. But, you know, some people do struggle, especially at the beginning. I think it's mostly because they don't know how to eat this way, and it can be confusing. One thing I do hear a lot is, especially when women start going low carb, they might run into a lot of problems. So as a woman, what would you recommend if people listening right now want to get started with this? What are some things they need to keep in mind? What's the best way to do it?
So I think that from my personal experience, if you begin on this kind of a diet, the first thing I'd say is get everything checked, get a full blood screen. And, you know, often if you're young and healthy, there'll be things that haven't been flagged up, which will be flagged up as soon as you start on a diet. So obviously, not just for women, but for everyone, you know, familial hypercholesterolemia, any other problems that you might have metabolizing fat, these are all important to be aware of. And I should also say that it should always be done under strict surveillance by someone who knows what they're doing.
Yes.
So given all of that, I think that as a female changing your diet in this way, you need to keep your calories right when you begin. Because I think that when you drastically cut down on carbohydrates and increase relatively the amount of fat you're taking, your appetite goes, at least mine went.
Right.
And quite often when there's a drastic loss of weight, regardless of where that weight loss comes from, so it can also happen in a diet that's not restricting carbs, you do get some hormonal implications from that.
Yeah.
In terms of women, there are reports of polycystic ovaries being resolved or being improved upon through following this kind of a diet. And of course, it has a very anti-inflammatory effect. So a lot of, and women have a pro-inflammatory tendency. And this effect will be mitigated through the ketogenic diet. So I think that keeping calories constant, first of all, getting supervision from a doctor, getting all your bloods cleared, and then when you go on the diet, keeping your calories constant, making sure all your micronutrients are coming in. So another thing that I could foresee happening is, and I've read anecdotal reports of this, is if you are eating a huge amount of fat, which of course you shouldn't need to, eating to excess, as in eating excessive calories and excessive fat, then many people find it difficult to absorb what they're eating.
Sure.
And so they end up having micronutrient deficiencies. For instance, if you're eating jars of almond butter, not that I did it, but I could have been tempted to any day.
So that is one fat that's very easy to overeat. Let me just say that. Some aren't, and that one is.
Don't remind me. But yes, absolutely. So if you are, for instance, having jars and jars of almond butter, you're probably not absorbing your iron, you're not absorbing your zinc, you're not absorbing so many essential minerals. And your body needs them, your thyroid gland needs them, your hair needs them to grow. So I think that being very aware of your calories, your micronutrient intake, and making the diet, as we just talked about, as Mediterranean in style, I think, as possible. So, in an ideal world, I mean, sometimes when I am with other people and I'm eating at a restaurant in front of them, what I eat may not seem remarkable to them, because essentially a Mediterranean ketogenic diet involves lots of leafy greens, various colors, heaps of olive oil, avocados. I eat a lot of seafood. I eat lots of chicken. It's a standard diet without anything odd about it. So I'm not going there and putting the entire jar of butter on my plate, just to do that. But if you actually calculate the macronutrients on my plate, they will show a 70% fat, 20% protein, and 10% carb ratio. Yeah. So just focusing on that rather than just, focusing on taking too much fat, I think helps people avoid the pitfalls of not absorbing nutrients
Right.
or not getting enough calories, because if you eat in that way, your appetite isn't completely squashed, so you can still
Yeah.
maintain your calories.
And it's you really need to learn how to eat again. You need to re-examine your relationship with what hunger means to you. And so when you talk about calories, I think so many people are used to the idea that they need to count every one, they need to reduce them as much as possible. When you start eating this way, it's actually, you more want to balance them out to your activity, to your energy levels, and make sure that you're eating enough, but not too much. But actually, I think it's only hard because we're not used to that. We're used to being like, I'm hungry, I need to eat right now. And when that starts going away, all of a sudden you're just like, I could eat right now or not. I kind of feel cool. And so I think some people push that too far, myself included. Like you said, one of the fun parts of it, treating yourself like a guinea pig is you can push it too far and mess it up and screw it up or be as wacky as you want. But when you do push it too far, you fast for too long, or you're not getting enough calories from fat or other parts of your diet, then all of a sudden things do start to go wrong. And you second guess the whole thing. So you have to find that sweet spot.
You do. And I think that also this ties in a little bit with my, you mentioned earlier, my interest in stress. I think that, see, we live in a world where everything is instant. Everything is instantaneous. So we are losing our ability to rely on delayed gratification. And I think food is one of the prime examples of it. In the morning, my old habit was in the morning, you wake up, go to Starbucks, grab a bagel and a coffee. And you have that bagel and you get that high. You have the coffee, your eyes flip open,
Right.
and it registers. You have had breakfast. And until you get that signal, you haven't had breakfast. No matter how many, I don't know, pumpkin seeds or whatever smoothies you have,
Sure.
You need that signal for your breakfast. And it's the same with lunch, and it's the same, every time you have a meal. So insulin hugely dictates our appetite, because, as I hope most people know by now, if you have a large carbohydrate load, you have an insulin spike that crashes, or that crashes your glucose level, and then you suddenly feel hungry. And that's your signal. That seems to become the most salient signal you need for food.
Yeah.
So in a ketogenic diet, that completely went away for me. Completely went away. And as you say, just like you, apart from the almond butter, I really had a very good control over my appetite.
Yeah.
And coming back to the issue of stress, everything, including food, is used to trap us, to attract our attention, to entertain us during the day. And you wake up, you go to work, you walk past coffee shops, and you see there's a sign down my road telling me there are masses of donuts at the bottom of some stairs. I mean, it doesn't affect me now, obviously, but it would definitely affect so many people.
Sure.
So this whole society where we want something now, we want a signal now, has become so ingrained in our world. We're not prepared to cook. We're not prepared to think of the consequences of what we are eating.
Yeah.
And I think being on a ketogenic diet allows you to plan that, because you really think about what you're eating. You think, because you're not just drawn to the food signal. You don't just have to have food right now.
Right.
You can think and you can plan and you can do well. And that keeps you in such a calm state of mind that you can apply that principle actually to so many other things, because you're not always driven by food and the need for food and for hunger.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And this has been so fascinating. I can't believe it, but we're coming up on time. Before we go, would you mind me telling people where they can find you and what you're working on next?
Sure. Well, I'm working on a book called The Resilient Brain. It's a book entirely on stress and on scientific ways that you can use to make your brain, make yourself completely, or as much as possible, resilient to stress, using all the latest science. I talk about nutrition, I talk about psychology, I talk about physiology. I've put over 300 papers together to write this book, but it is a book that everyone should be able to understand.
Yeah.
So that's coming out next year.
Excellent.
I also have a fun blog in the meantime where I put some stuff up. It's called Brain Boost Camp. www.brainboostcamp.com. And I'm also on Twitter, and I put up some papers every now and again.
Excellent. And if you're interested in ketosis, definitely check out Mithu's paper. We'll link to it from the blog post. This has been so fascinating. I've been geeking out the whole time. I would love to have you back. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much, Abel, for having me.
Before you go, don't forget to grab your listener discount on our 30-day fat loss plan. In this plan, we share 30 days of mouth-watering wild diet meal plans that are designed to help you drop fat with real food. The meal plans are paleo-friendly, easy to make, and literally the meals that my wife Allison and I eat just about every day and night to stay lean, fit, and happy. In the program, you'll get the most effective method of meal and nutrient timing to best stimulate fat loss and muscle recovery, the truth about how much protein you really need for your body type, 30 days of specific, healthy, fat-burning meal plans as a done-for-you nutrition strategy, and tons more. If you check it out today, you'll even get a listener discount. All you have to do is type in fatburningman.com/30 days. That's the number 30, DAYS. Once again, that's fatburningman.com/30 days. I'll see you there. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Fat Burning Man. If you liked it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, the podcast app, or wherever else you might be listening to or watching this show. Got a second? Please leave me a quick review on iTunes. I always love hearing from you, and if you think someone else might like and benefit from this free show, please take a second to share it with a friend or with a family member. You can get in touch with me on Twitter at FatBurnMan and Facebook by typing in Abel James or Fat Burning Man. Drop me a line anytime. Did you know that I've recorded over 150 episodes of Fat Burning Man, winning 4 awards in independent media and hitting #1 in more than 8 countries? And here's some more good news. You can download and listen to every single episode for free. All you have to do is type in fatburningman.com. I'll give you a second to type it in, fatburningman.com. And you'll get all the show notes in video and audio versions for all the past episodes of Fat Burning Man. Better yet, enter your best email at fatburningman.com, sign up for my newsletter, and I'll even send you a quick start guide to start burning fat right now and a few of our ridiculously tasty recipes as a special thanks for signing up. Once again, just go to fatburningman.com right now, enter your best email to get your free fat burning download straight to your inbox, and make sure that you never miss a show again. This is Abel James signing off. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.
People, getting promotions, finding their dream job, publishing their first book. I mean, just incredible stories like that. Yeah. And the point is that they were already doing affirmations just in a negative way.